The conference room aboard the diplomatic station hadn't been used in years. The polished alloy walls, still gleaming, reflected the faint shimmer of the stars visible through the viewports. Marcus Vallon, a seasoned human envoy, stood near the head of the table, reviewing the terms of the proposed agreement once more on his datapad. Despite his experience in negotiations with various species, the upcoming meeting with Queen Zalaris of the Shinai had left him unusually tense. Next to him, Captain Elias Redding, a longtime friend and, more recently, his bodyguard, leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. Elias had never been one for diplomatic meetings. A military man through and through, he'd seen his fair share of conflicts. For him, watching Marcus try to finesse his way through political minefields was both nerve-wracking and amusing. "Relax, Marcus," Elias said with a smirk. "You've faced worse than a royal alien with a superiority complex." "This isn't a simple negotiation," Marcus replied, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "The Shinai have been insular for centuries. If we push too hard, we risk offending them. Too soft, and we lose the chance to gain their trust." Elias shook his head. "Diplomats, always worried about offending someone. Sometimes a little blunt honesty works wonders, you know?" Before Marcus could reply, the doors slid open, and two Shinai guards entered. They were tall and elegant, their emerald skin shimmering faintly under the station's artificial lighting. Behind them, Queen Zalaris appeared. She was every bit as imposing as Marcus had been warned. Her silver hair was pulled back into a braided crown, and her piercing violet eyes scanned the room with an air of cool authority. She wore a flowing, intricately detailed robe that seemed to shift in color as she moved. "I assume you are Marcus Vallon," Zalaris said, her tone clipped and formal. "The one who claims to represent the interests of humanity." Marcus straightened, offering a polite bow of his head. "Your Majesty, it's an honor to meet you. I trust your journey here was uneventful." She tilted her head slightly. "Your trust is misplaced. My journey is of no consequence to this meeting." Elias cleared his throat loudly, drawing her gaze. "Captain Elias Redding," he said bluntly. "I'm here to make sure no one tries anything unwise." Zalaris's lips quirked upward in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. How very human. Always prepared for conflict. "Better safe than sorry," Elias replied, unfazed. "But we're not here to cause trouble." She turned back to Marcus. "Then I suggest we begin. You wish to discuss trade agreements, do you not?" Marcus nodded, gesturing toward the table. "Please, let's sit and review the proposed terms. I'm confident we can find a mutually beneficial arrangement." The Queen moved gracefully to the seat across from him, but she didn't sit right away. "Your confidence is noteworthy, envoy, but do not mistake it for authority. We Shinai have maintained our independence and prosperity without outside interference for generations." Elias leaned in slightly, his voice a quiet murmur. "Marcus, you might want to tread carefully here." "I'm aware," Marcus replied under his breath. Then, looking back to Zalaris, he said, "I have no intention of undermining your autonomy, Your Majesty. My goal is to foster cooperation, not to impose." At that, Zalaris lowered herself into the chair. "Very well. Let us see if your intentions match your actions." For the next hour, the discussion was a tense dance of carefully chosen words and subtle shifts in tone. Marcus presented the potential benefits of a partnership: shared technologies, enhanced trade routes, and cultural exchange programs. Zalaris listened, her expression unreadable, occasionally posing pointed questions. Each time she did, Marcus responded with measured diplomacy, while Elias sat silently, his sharp eyes watching for any sign of aggression. At one point, Zalaris paused, studying Marcus with a slight tilt of her head. "You speak of cooperation, yet you carry the weight of humanity's mistakes. Tell me, envoy, what makes you believe the Shinai would fare any better by aligning with you?" Marcus met her gaze evenly. "Because humanity has learned from its mistakes. We don't claim to be perfect, but we strive for progress. I believe that together, We can achieve something greater than either of us could alone. Her violet eyes narrowed slightly, as if searching for any hint of deceit. Bold words, Envoy. I wonder if you truly believe them, or if you are simply adept at saying what you think I wish to hear. Elias's voice broke the tension. If Marcus says it, he means it. He's a stubborn idealist like that. Zalaris raised an eyebrow at Elias's interjection but said nothing, instead turning her attention back to Marcus. Then perhaps you will have the chance to prove it. For now, I will consider what you have said. She rose from her chair with a fluid grace, her guards instantly moving to escort her. As she reached the doorway, she glanced back over her shoulder. Envoy, I trust that when we meet again, you will have something more substantial to offer. Marcus inclined his head. Of course, Your Majesty. Until then. Once she was gone, Elias let out a low whistle. Well, that went about as well as could be expected. At least she didn't storm out or have us arrested. Marcus sank into his chair, exhaling heavily. It's just the first step. There's still a long way to go. Elias clapped him on the shoulder. And I'll be here to make sure you don't screw it up too badly. Marcus managed a small smile. Good to know. Now let's get to work. Chapter 2. The Treaty That Almost Was. Marcus leaned back in the conference room's padded chair, staring at the holographic treaty projected above the center of the table. The terms looked good. Reasonable trade concessions from both sides, shared research on energy efficiency, and a cooperative defense framework that offered mutual support without stepping on anyone's sovereignty. To him, it was a sound, carefully balanced agreement. The only problem was that Queen Zalaris didn't seem to agree. She's not signing, Elias stated, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. He had his usual, I told you so expression plastered on his face. Not yet, Marcus replied, his tone more hopeful than confident. She just needs time to see the benefits. I know she's cautious, but she's not unreasonable. Elias snorted. You didn't hear her speech yesterday. She went on about how humans have always sought to dominate, how the Shinai are better off without our meddling. Honestly, I thought she was going to declare war. Marcus waved a hand dismissively. She's posturing. Zalaris is under pressure from her advisors, and they're pushing her to be as wary as possible. It's political theater. Elias wasn't convinced. Sure, but she outright called you her enemy. You don't call someone your enemy just for show. She's trying to maintain her position. That's all it is, Marcus said. He turned off the hologram, pushed back his chair, and stood. I'm meeting with her again in an hour. I'll get her to come around. Want me there? Elias asked. I can play the heavy, just in case she starts throwing more accusations. Marcus shook his head. No, I'll handle it. If we come at her with more force, it'll only make her dig in. But thanks. Suit yourself, Elias said, heading for the door. Just don't say I didn't warn you. An hour later, Marcus found himself in the Queen's private chambers aboard the station. This time it was just the two of them, without the presence of guards or advisors. The room was opulent but not ostentatious. Soft lighting, intricate tapestries on the walls, and a table set with exotic Shinai fruit that gleamed like polished jewels. Zalaris sat at the far end of the room, her posture regal and composed. When Marcus entered, she didn't look up immediately. Instead, she studied a small, glowing tablet in her hands. After a moment, she set it aside and gave him her full attention. Envoy Valen, she said coolly, gesturing to the seat across from her. You insist on these face-to-face discussions, yet they yield little progress. What new arguments have you prepared to sway me today? Marcus sat down, trying to appear calm despite the weight of the conversation. I don't have new arguments, Your Majesty. I just want to better understand your concerns. She raised an eyebrow. A clever way of admitting you have no compelling evidence. Not at all, he replied smoothly. I think the terms we've proposed are fair and balanced. But if there's something you find objectionable, something we haven't addressed, then I'd like to know so we can work through it. Zalaris leaned back in her chair, studying him. You speak as if we are equals in this matter. As if the Shinai have anything to gain from aligning with humanity. What makes you so certain we even want what you offer? I'm not certain, Marcus admitted. I can only offer what I believe will benefit both sides. But this is about more than just trade routes or resource sharing. It's about fostering understanding, creating a partnership that could prevent future misunderstandings. She sighed softly, folding her hands on the table. Do you truly believe humanity and the Shinai can coexist in harmony? I believe it's worth trying, he said. Because the alternative, remaining isolated, mistrusting one another, isn't sustainable. Her violet eyes locked onto his, and for a moment Marcus thought he saw a flicker of something other than cold calculation. You speak with conviction, envoy. I can't help but wonder if it is genuine or simply well-rehearsed. I'm not rehearsing anything, he said, leaning forward slightly. I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe in what I'm proposing. Zalaris held his gaze a moment longer, then broke eye contact, looking down at the table. You're kind. You have a way of making promises that sound too good to be true. I have no reason to trust that your words will match your actions. Then let us prove it, Marcus said. Give us a chance to show you we mean what we say. She hesitated, her fingers tapping lightly on the polished surface. Your optimism is remarkable, but optimism alone is not enough. I understand that, Marcus replied, which is why I'm willing to work with you to find solutions that satisfy both our peoples. Tell me, what do you need to feel more confident in this agreement? Zalaris exhaled slowly, as if weighing her options. I need to see evidence. Real evidence that humanity can commit to more than words. Until then, I will not endorse this treaty. That's fair, Marcus said, nodding. Then let's start there. Tell me what kind of evidence you'd find convincing, and I'll do my best to provide it. The Queen's lips quirked ever so slightly, a hint of a smile, though it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. You are persistent, envoy. Very well. I will consider your request. But know this, the moment you fail to deliver, this discussion ends. Permanently. Understood, Marcus said. He stood and offered a respectful bow. Thank you for your time, Your Majesty. I'll bring you the proof you need. As he turned to leave, Zalaris's voice stopped him. Marcus. He turned back, surprised to hear her address him by name. Do not waste my time, she said, her tone softer than before. I won't, he replied, meeting her gaze once more before stepping out. Chapter 3. The Cultural Exchange. Marcus stood at the edge of the Shinai ceremonial grounds, his steps hesitant as he took in the sweeping, alien architecture around him. A vast field of silvery grass extended in all directions, with crystalline spires rising from the earth like natural monuments. Dotted among the spires were circular pavilions where Shinai gathered in vibrant clusters. The air hummed faintly, a blend of unfamiliar music and the rhythmic chanting of the Shinai festival participants. I feel like a tourist in someone's sacred temple, Marcus muttered, glancing over at Elias. The captain chuckled and clapped him on the back. You are a tourist in someone's sacred temple. Just try not to step on any ceremonial flowers, and you'll be fine. You make it sound simple, Marcus replied, shaking his head. He adjusted his diplomatic sash and took a steadying breath. All right, let's go. As they approached the first pavilion, a pair of Shinai attendants stepped forward. Their emerald skin gleamed under the light of the twin moons overhead, and their expressions were calm but watchful. One of them, a tall man with a crown of delicate silver filaments sprouting from his head, bowed slightly and gestured toward the heart of the festival. Envoy Valen, the Shinai said, his voice low and resonant. Her Majesty has granted you access to this celebration. Please, follow me. Marcus nodded, stepping into line behind the guide. Elias stayed close, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd as if expecting trouble at any moment. They walked deeper into the gathering, past dancers who moved in fluid, hypnotic patterns, and musicians playing instruments that shimmered like liquid glass. The air was thick with the scent of exotic blooms, sweet and intoxicating. What's the occasion? Elias asked, his voice low. Marcus glanced at the guide. I think this is one of their harvest festivals. A time of renewal and giving thanks. Elias smirked. Seems more like a giant alien rave. Marcus shot him a look but didn't argue. The festival had an otherworldly, almost surreal quality, and he couldn't help but feel both awe and a touch of unease. The Shinai culture was so different, so unlike anything he'd encountered before, and yet there was something compelling about their traditions. Something that felt alive in a way that words couldn't fully capture. They finally reached a large, open-air pavilion where Queen Zalaris stood. She was surrounded by advisors and high-ranking Shinai officials, all dressed in ceremonial garb that shimmered with iridescent hues. The queen's silver hair was braided and adorned with intricate ornaments, and her violet eyes seemed to shine more brightly than usual. Marcus felt Elias nudge him. Better put your diplomat face on. She's watching us. The queen stepped forward, her gaze steady as it met Marcus's. Envoy Valen, Captain Redding, I see you have found your way to our festival. We're honored to be here, Marcus said with a respectful bow. It's a remarkable event. The artistry, the music, it's extraordinary. Zalaris inclined her head slightly. It is a celebration of our harvest season. A time when we reflect on the cycles of life and the bonds of our people. And I appreciate you allowing me to witness it firsthand, Marcus said. Understanding your culture helps me see the world through your eyes, which can only improve our discussions. Her lips curved faintly. A clever way of saying you hope it will soften my stance. I won't deny that, Marcus admitted. But my respect for your culture is genuine. Zalaris's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she gestured toward a nearby table laden with Shinai delicacies. Come, taste our offerings and learn of our traditions. Perhaps you will find inspiration here. Marcus and Elias stepped forward, joining a group of Shinai elders at the table. The conversation flowed easily at first, with the elders explaining the significance of each dish, the stories behind the ornate decorations, and the meaning of the chants that echoed through the air. Marcus listened attentively, asking questions and making mental notes. Elias, meanwhile, sampled the food and gave nods of approval that seemed to amuse the Shinai hosts. When Zalaris joined them, the tone shifted. The elders deferred to her, and Marcus felt the weight of her presence. She stood close enough that he caught a faint scent, something like sea salt mixed with crushed petals. He wasn't sure if it was her perfume or a natural trait of her people, but it made his pulse quicken. I wonder, Zalaris said, her voice smooth and thoughtful, if humanity has anything comparable to this, a festival that brings your people together in such a meaningful way. We have many celebrations, Marcus replied. Some are religious, others cultural or national. But it's true, something as deeply tied to the land and the seasons as this? That's rare these days. It is the land that sustains us, Zalaris said. The cycles that remind us of our place in the universe. To forget that is to lose oneself. Marcus nodded, trying to match her tone. Perhaps humanity could learn from the Shinai in that regard. Her eyes searched his face for a moment before she turned away, addressing the elders. Ensure that the envoy and his companion have all they need to enjoy the festival. We will continue our discussions tomorrow. As Zalaris moved on, Elias leaned in close to Marcus. I think she likes you. Marcus glanced at him, surprised. What makes you say that? Elias smirked. The way she kept looking at you, like she's trying to figure you out. She's cautious, that's all, Marcus said. And we're a long way from any kind of trust. Maybe, but I'm telling you, there's something there. You might not see it, but I do. Marcus frowned, unsure how to respond. He watched as Zalaris disappeared into the crowd, her regal bearing unmistakable. Whatever Elias thought he saw, Marcus wasn't ready to believe it. Not yet. But as the festival continued and the night wore on, he couldn't deny that the Queen's presence lingered in his mind, a thought he couldn't quite shake. Chapter 4. The Unexpected Confession. The artificial lighting in Marcus's quarters flickered briefly as the station's environmental systems adjusted to the Shinai energy nodes. He sat at his desk, flipping through holographic notes on the latest treaty revisions. The silence, broken only by the faint hum of the station, let his thoughts wander back to the festival from the night before. He hadn't seen Queen Zalaris since she'd left the table. And yet, she lingered in his mind, not just as a political figure but as someone he was beginning to view in a different light. Elias stepped into the room, carrying a steaming cup of synth brew. "You look like you've been chewing on those clauses for hours." "Feels like I have," Marcus replied. "Every time I think I've smoothed out the language, I find another point that could offend her advisors." Elias set the cup down and leaned against the wall. "Maybe you should stop focusing on what might offend them and figure out what actually matters to her." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" "She's not just some figurehead. Zalaris is smart, calculated. If you can figure out what drives her, what she wants for her people, then maybe you don't need to keep rewriting the same terms over and over." "Easier said than done," Marcus muttered. "Her motivations aren't exactly transparent." Elias smirked. "Maybe not, but I've seen the way she looks at you. She's got more on her mind than trade agreements." Marcus shot him a sharp glance. "You keep saying that. What are you implying?" "I'm saying," Elias replied, holding up his hands, "that you might want to stop thinking of her as just a negotiating partner. She's a person. Get to know her beyond the politics." Before Marcus could respond, his terminal beeped. He glanced at the screen and saw an unexpected communication request from Queen Zalaris herself. He hesitated, then accepted the call. Her image appeared regal and composed as if she were choosing her words carefully. "I have been reviewing the proposed terms you provided. There are aspects I find intriguing." "That's good to hear," Marcus said cautiously. "Which aspects, specifically?" She leaned slightly closer to the display, her tone softening. "It is not the clauses themselves, but rather the underlying intent. You speak of cooperation in a way that suggests genuine trust. I find that unusual given the history between our peoples." Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "Unusual? I wouldn't say that. It's just—" "Do not mistake me," she interrupted. "I do not mean it as a criticism. I am merely curious. About you." He stared at her for a moment, unsure how to respond. "Curious?" "Yes," she said, her voice lowering slightly. "You carry yourself with a confidence that borders on recklessness, and yet you do not seem reckless. It is paradoxical." Elias, still leaning against the wall, raised his eyebrows and made a silent told-you-so gesture. Marcus ignored him. "I'm not sure what to say to that, Your Majesty," Marcus admitted. "Perhaps there is nothing that must be said," she replied. "I simply wish to understand you better, and perhaps to convey that my earlier declaration, that you were my enemy, was spoken in haste." "Are you saying you don't see me as an enemy anymore?" he asked, his voice tinged with hope. "I am saying," she said carefully, "that I see you in a different light, one I am not yet certain how to define." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This was not the conversation he had anticipated. "Your Majesty, I appreciate your candor. It means a lot that you'd reach out to say this. You are the first human I have met who speaks as you do," she continued. "You challenge me, and, in truth, I find that compelling." Elias gave a low whistle, drawing a sharp look from Marcus. "I hope that isn't inappropriate to say," Zalaris added, her regal composure momentarily faltering. "No, it's not inappropriate," Marcus assured her quickly. "It's just unexpected." "Unexpected indeed," she said. For the first time, a faint smile curved her lips. "I will leave you to your work, envoy. But perhaps we might speak again informally before our next official meeting." "I'd like that," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within him. As the call ended, Elias chuckled. "See? Told you. She likes you." Marcus turned to him, his face a mix of confusion and cautious optimism. "She's just curious. That's all." "Yeah. Keep telling yourself that, buddy," Elias said with a grin. "But I think you've got more than just a treaty to work on now. Marcus shook his head, though he couldn't entirely suppress a small smile. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm just saying, don't be surprised if she starts showing up for informal chats more often, Elias said. Now come on. You owe me a drink. Marcus sighed and stood, allowing Elias to lead the way. As they walked down the station's corridor, his thoughts remained on Zolaris's words, her voice lingering in his mind. It wasn't just her candid confession that had caught him off guard. It was the way it made him feel. Chapter 5: The Trial of Trust. Marcus stood just outside the station's command hub, staring down at the data on his tablet. Reports of a possible sabotage attempt were rolling in, the Shinai's advanced communications network buzzing with activity. He glanced up, catching Elias's wary expression. Tell me again how this isn't a bad sign, Elias said, his tone dry. It's not a bad sign, Marcus replied, though his voice lacked conviction. It's a challenge. One we'll handle. Right? Elias said, rolling his eyes. And you think Zolaris had no idea this would happen? I don't think she's behind it, Marcus said firmly. She has too much to lose if the treaty falls apart now. Elias crossed his arms. Doesn't mean someone in her court isn't trying to pull the rug out from under us. Which is why we need to address this carefully, Marcus replied. Panic and accusations will just push them further away. Elias sighed, then gestured toward the command hub door. You've got another meeting with Her Majesty, right? What's your plan? Marcus glanced back at his tablet, then shrugged. Honesty. I'll tell her what we found and suggest we work together to root out the cause. Sure, Elias said, his tone skeptical. Because asking for help always goes over so well in politics. Ignoring the remark, Marcus straightened his sash and stepped through the doors. Zolaris was already waiting, standing near a large, translucent screen displaying the station's sensor grid. She turned as he entered, her expression unreadable. Envoy Valen, she said. You requested this meeting rather urgently. I trust you have a good reason. I do, Marcus said, inclining his head in a respectful gesture. We've detected signs of sabotage, something that could jeopardize the treaty discussions. I believe it's in both our interests to address this before it escalates. Zolaris raised a delicate eyebrow. Sabotage? That is a serious accusation. What evidence do you have? Marcus stepped closer to the display, tapping a command into his tablet. The screen filled with data. Unusual power surges in critical systems, unexplained signal disruptions, and a flag transmission originating from within the Shinai delegation's quarters. We've tracked multiple anomalies, he explained. Power fluctuations, unauthorized transmissions, all originating from areas under Shinai control. I'm not accusing your people, Your Majesty, but I think we need to investigate this together. Zolaris studied the data, her eyes narrowing. You suggest this is coming from within my delegation, yet you stop short of placing blame. Why? Because I don't believe you're behind it, Marcus said. I think someone is acting independently, trying to undermine these talks. And I trust that you would want to prevent that as much as I do. For a moment, Zolaris said nothing. Then she turned to her advisors, who had been standing silently near the wall. Leave us, she ordered. The advisors hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances, but a sharp look from the queen sent them scurrying from the room. Once they were alone, she faced Marcus fully. If what you say is true, she began, then someone in my court is conspiring against my wishes. That would be unacceptable. It would also mean they're putting everything we've worked for at risk, Marcus said. Zolaris stepped closer, her violet eyes fixed on his. You came to me with this instead of reporting it to your own superiors. Why? Because I want to build trust, he said simply. Pointing fingers and escalating tensions won't solve anything. We have a chance to show that we can work together, even in the face of something like this. For the first time, Zolaris's expression softened. Trust is not given lightly among my people, Envoy Valen. But your approach, it is unexpected. Unexpected doesn't mean unwelcome, Marcus said. If we can root out the cause of this together, It might be the first real step toward a genuine partnership. She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. Very well. I will have my security team begin a discreet investigation. In the meantime, I suggest you ensure that your own delegation is not compromised. If we are to trust each other, that trust must be mutual. Agreed, Marcus said. Elias appeared at the door just as Marcus was leaving. So? He asked. She's willing to investigate on her side, Marcus said. It's a start. Elias gave a low whistle. Didn't think she'd go for it. Guess you're rubbing off on her. Marcus smirked. Let's just focus on finding out who's behind this. That's what really matters. Sure, Elias said, clapping him on the shoulder. But I still say you've got her attention. Just don't screw it up. As the two walked down the corridor, the sense of unease lingered, but so did the first faint glimmer of cooperation. And in that moment, Marcus felt they might actually have a chance to move forward together. Chapter 6. Forbidden Feelings. Marcus stood in the observation lounge, the stars beyond the station's massive viewport stretching into infinite bands of light. He often came here when the pressures of the negotiations became too much, when the weight of humanity's expectations felt unbearable. Tonight, however, he wasn't alone. Elias leaned back against the nearby railing, sipping a steaming cup of synth brew. You know, he said, his voice low and even, it's not like you to get this distracted. Something on your mind. Marcus hesitated, hands resting on the edge of the window's frame. It's Zolaris, he admitted. No kidding, Elias said, smirking. I've noticed the way she's been looking at you lately. You two spend more time alone than the rest of us spend on this entire mission. It's not like that, Marcus said quickly. She's complicated. Elias raised an eyebrow. Complicated how? Marcus sighed, leaning his forehead against the cool glass. Every time we talk, I can't help but feel like there's more going on beneath the surface. She's not just a leader. There's a side of her I'm not sure I fully understand. Sounds like you're trying to, Elias said. Marcus turned toward his friend. And that's exactly the problem. I can't let myself get drawn into something that's not about the treaty. I'm here to secure a partnership between our people, not whatever this is. Elias gave him a long, measured look. Marcus, you've been through enough negotiations to know that nothing's ever just about the treaty. Relationships matter. If you can connect with her on a personal level, it might even help you reach a better agreement. That's not the same thing, Marcus said. This isn't just a professional connection anymore. I don't know if I can separate the personal from the political. Elias smirked again, taking another sip of his drink. Sounds like you're already past that point. Before Marcus could respond, the door slid open. Both men turned to see Queen Zolaris standing there, her silver hair reflecting the soft lights of the lounge. She was dressed in a less formal robe than usual, a delicate shimmer to the fabric that caught Marcus's eye. Envoy Valen, she said, her voice as calm and steady as ever. May I have a word? Marcus straightened. Of course, Your Majesty. He glanced at Elias, who gave him a knowing look before stepping out. Marcus followed Zolaris toward a quieter corner of the lounge. I realize this is an unusual time to call upon you, Zolaris began. But there are matters I wish to discuss. Marcus tried to keep his tone neutral. What's on your mind? She hesitated, her violet eyes flicking toward the stars outside. You have shown a sincerity that is rare among those I have encountered. It is disarming. I appreciate that, Marcus said. I've tried to be honest with you, even when it's difficult. Yes, she said, turning to face him fully. And that honesty has made this difficult for me as well. What do you mean? He asked, his voice cautious. Zolaris stepped closer, her tone softer now. I mean that I find myself questioning my own instincts. You were my adversary at first, a representative of a people I was trained to view with suspicion. But now you are something more. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Your Majesty, She held up a hand. Please, let me finish. He nodded, remaining silent. Zalaris took a breath, as though summoning the courage to continue. You have shown me a side of humanity I did not expect. Your passion, your dedication, your willingness to bridge the divide between us. It is not merely admirable. It is compelling. Marcus struggled to find the right words. I didn't come here expecting to feel this way either. But the more I get to know you, the more I realize there's so much more to you than your title. She took another step closer, the faintest trace of vulnerability in her expression. This connection we share, it goes beyond politics. I feel it as much as you do. Before he could stop himself, Marcus reached out, brushing his fingers against hers. The touch was tentative, fleeting, but electric. Zalaris didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hands slightly, letting their fingers intertwine for a brief moment before pulling back. I must return to my quarters, she said softly. But I needed you to know. Marcus felt the weight of her words as she turned and walked away. Standing alone in the lounge, he stared at the spot where she had stood, his mind racing. He hadn't anticipated this, hadn't prepared for the feelings that now churned within him. The treaty negotiations were already fragile. Adding a personal connection could make things even more complicated. Elias returned a few moments later, noting the look on Marcus's face. So, he said, his tone light. How'd that little chat go? Marcus shook his head, unsure of how to answer. Complicated. Elias chuckled. Yeah, I figured as much. Well, get some rest. We've got another round of talks tomorrow. As Marcus made his way back to his quarters, he couldn't shake the memory of her voice, her touch. It was more than he'd expected, and it left him wondering just how far he was willing to go, both for the treaty and for the connection he could no longer ignore. Chapter 7. The Ultimatum. The atmosphere in the meeting chamber was heavier than usual. Marcus sat at the long conference table, his datapad in front of him, though he hadn't glanced at it in the last 5 minutes. His focus was fixed on the figure across from him, Queen Zalaris, her regal composure intact but her tone clipped and unyielding. It was clear something had changed. My advisors believe that continuing these discussions with humanity is a mistake, Zalaris said, her voice steady. They argue that we risk losing our cultural integrity, our sovereignty. And what do you believe, Your Majesty? Marcus asked carefully. I believe, she said, folding her hands in front of her, that we must tread cautiously. The Shinai people have endured for generations without external alliances. To align ourselves now, after so many years, would be unprecedented. Marcus leaned forward slightly. I understand that, but you know this isn't about taking something from you or forcing change upon your people. It's about building something together. Zalaris's violet eyes narrowed, though not in anger, more in thought. Words are easy, Envoy Valen. Actions are what matter. I agree completely, Marcus said, and I'm ready to take action. If there's something you need to see from us, something that would prove our intentions, tell me. I'll make it happen. She studied him, silent for a long moment. You speak as though the choice is mine alone, but it is not. There are voices in my court who demand I sever these negotiations entirely. They insist that we return to isolation, that we declare humanity an adversary. Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. And what do you want, Zalaris? Elias, who had been quietly observing from the corner, raised an eyebrow at the informal address. Marcus ignored him. What do I want? Zalaris repeated, as if the question had caught her off guard. I want to protect my people. I want to ensure their future. And I want... She paused, her voice faltering briefly. I want to understand the path forward. That's why we're here, Marcus said. To find that path together. Her gaze softened just a fraction. I wish it were that simple. Elias decided to step in. Your Majesty, I've been with Marcus through countless negotiations. He's not the kind to play games or make empty promises. If he says he'll do something, he'll do it. Zalaris's expression didn't change, but her eyes flicked to Elias for a moment before returning to Marcus. Your loyalty to him is evident, but loyalty does not guarantee success. No, Marcus said, but it's a start, and I'm loyal to this effort. I believe we can create something lasting here. Belief, she murmured, almost to herself. She straightened in her chair, her regal bearing returning. I will not make a decision tonight. My advisors must be consulted, and I must weigh their counsel. Of course, Marcus said, trying to mask his disappointment. But I hope you'll consider what we've discussed. As Zalaris rose to leave, she hesitated, glancing back at Marcus. This will be our last meeting before I deliver my final decision. I suggest you prepare for every outcome. Marcus inclined his head. Understood. When she left the room, Elias let out a low whistle. That sounded ominous. She's under pressure, Marcus said, standing. Her advisors have been pushing her in the opposite direction since the beginning. I can't blame her for feeling torn. Elias leaned against the table, folding his arms. So, what's the plan now? Marcus shook his head. I don't know. There's not much more I can say to convince her. She has to decide for herself. Elias frowned. You're just going to wait? That doesn't sound like you. No, Marcus admitted. But at this point, forcing it might do more harm than good. Elias grinned wryly. You know, for someone who's supposed to be all about action, you're surprisingly patient when it comes to her. Marcus gave him a look. This isn't just about her. Could have fooled me, Elias muttered, taking his cup of synth brew and heading toward the door. Well, whatever happens, you've done everything you can. Marcus stayed behind, staring at the empty chair where Zalaris had sat. Her words echoed in his mind, and despite his usual confidence, he felt a pang of doubt. This had always been a delicate balancing act, but now it felt more precarious than ever. Still, he knew one thing for certain. No matter what Zalaris decided, he wouldn't give up on the vision they had started to build. Chapter 8: The Bond Endures. The air in the conference room was thick with tension. Marcus and Elias stood near the viewport, the swirling expanse of stars outside offering little comfort. The final decision was due any moment. Queen Zalaris had made it clear this would be her last meeting with the human delegation, and whatever she declared now would shape the future of the two civilizations. Anything you want to say before we go in? Elias asked, crossing his arms. Marcus adjusted his diplomatic sash, a habit more than a necessity. Not much to say. We've done all we can. Now it's up to her. Elias smirked. Well, let's hope she's been listening to that silver tongue of yours. You've certainly spent enough time trying to win her over. Not helpful, Marcus said, though his tone lacked bite. He glanced at the door. Come on. No point in delaying. When they entered, Zalaris was already seated, her advisors flanking her on both sides. The air around her was as composed and serene as ever, but Marcus noted a subtle tension in her posture. She looked up as they approached and gestured for them to sit. You asked for this meeting, Zalaris said without preamble. I assume you have something important to say. Marcus nodded, clearing his throat. Your Majesty, I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to negotiate. No matter the outcome, it's been an honor to work towards something greater. Her eyes flickered, just for an instant, with an emotion he couldn't quite place. You speak as though the decision has already been made. Hasn't it? Elias said bluntly. Marcus shot him a warning glance, but Zalaris only smiled faintly. Isers remain divided, and I have no illusions about the challenges that lie ahead. This agreement is fragile. It will require constant effort from both sides. And we're prepared for that, Marcus said. You have my word. Elias let out a soft chuckle. Looks like your persistence paid off. Zalaris turned her gaze to Elias. Your captain is right. Your persistence has been remarkable. Marcus inclined his head. I believe in this partnership, Your Majesty, and I believe in your leadership. Her expression softened again. You place much faith in me, Envoy Valen. Perhaps more than I deserve. I don't think that's true, Marcus said gently. Your strength, your wisdom, they're what brought us to this point. I trust that you'll guide our alliance toward a better future. Zalaris's advisors shifted uncomfortably, but she ignored them. For a moment, it seemed as though she might say something more personal, something beyond the formalities of diplomacy. Instead, she stood, her bearing as regal as ever. "This meeting is concluded," she said. "Prepare the final documents. I will sign them tomorrow." "Understood," Marcus said, rising to his feet. As Zalaris turned to leave, she paused at the door. "Envoy Valen, a word." Marcus followed her into a side chamber, leaving Elias behind. Once they were alone, Zalaris turned to face him, her expression unguarded for the first time in weeks. "You fought for this treaty," she said quietly. "Even when it seemed impossible. You could have walked away, but you didn't." "I couldn't walk away," Marcus said. "Not from this. Not from you." Her eyes widened slightly, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I know I shouldn't say that. I know our positions make it complicated. But I meant every word I said. I trust you. And I—" "Marcus," she interrupted, her tone soft but firm. "I understand." Their gazes held, and for a moment, the tension between them felt like a physical force. Slowly, carefully, she reached out, brushing her fingers against his hand. It was a subtle gesture, yet it spoke volumes. "Whatever comes next," she said, "we will face it together." Marcus felt the weight of her words, the promise behind them. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Together, they stepped back, their connection unspoken but unmistakable. Without another word, Zalaris left the chamber. Marcus remained there for a moment, letting the reality of their shared understanding sink in. When he returned to the main room, Elias was waiting, his arms crossed and an eyebrow raised. "You gonna tell me what that was about? Or do I have to guess?" Marcus smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Let's just say it's a new beginning. For both of us."